Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in again to our little study on the water from the rock. This is part 2. And our passage today comes from Numbers 20, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 13. It's a little bit of a longer passage. Numbers 20, verses 1 to 13. Then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. There was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. The people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness, for us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us into this wretched place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. And he said to them, Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you have not believed me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. So first of all, it may or may not come to your mind if you're reading through Genesis through Deuteronomy, but seeing as we were just in Exodus 17 in part 1, a natural question that comes is this the same place? It's given the same name, Meribah, in verse 13, so is it the same place? Well, the short answer is no. In Exodus 17, the Israelites were on their way to Mount Sinai, where they're going to get the law. We know the Ten Commandments and the other laws that God gave, and they camped at Rephidim on the way, and that is clear in the passage in Exodus 17. Now, traditionally, Mount Sinai is located in the Sinai Peninsula, currently in present-day Egypt, south of Israel. But there are some who believe that Mount Sinai is actually east in Saudi Arabia. Regardless of what your belief is of where Mount Sinai is, Rephidim is on the way to Mount Sinai, and it is named Massa and Meribah, not because that's the actual location, but it's named that symbolically because Israel tested God. In Numbers 20, the location is Kadesh, which is close to Mount Hor, where Aaron dies. And Mount Hor is north of the Sinai Peninsula and west of Saudi Arabia, so it is a different location than Rephidim. No one knows exactly where Rephidim is, and it depends on where you believe Mount Sinai is, because Rephidim is in that vicinity. We do know where Kadesh is, close to Mount Hor, and Mount Hor is not anywhere close to where anyone believes Mount Sinai is. And so it's a different rock, different location. It ends up being a different generation. As in Exodus 17, Israelites have not gotten to Mount Sinai yet. They've not worshipped the golden calf. They have not tried to go into the promised land when they were told not to, because of the bad report from the 12 spies. The wanderings haven't started. They haven't been condemned to 40 years of wandering in the desert. In Numbers 20, their wandering is just about done. And so it is the children in Numbers 20 of the people from Exodus 17. And yet, with even all the differences between the two passages, when you read Numbers 20, your mind is supposed to go back to Exodus 17, because the connecting point is the rock and what Moses is instructed to do. And so verses 1 to 7 of Numbers 20 set the stage. very similar to Exodus 17. In verse 8, God does not appear to be angry. And we need to be careful how we interpret this. We need to be careful that we do not attribute God's patience with God's acceptance. God does not wink at sin, ever. And to complain against God is to sin against God. And just because God does not respond with discipline or punishment does not mean he's pleased. It does not mean that he approves of our behavior. So that's important as we read the complaining of the people, and yet God gives a word of instruction rather than a word of rebuke. Does not mean that their complaint is not heard or that it is not sin. God clearly instructs Moses and Aaron what they are to do. And it's interesting that in Numbers 20, Moses is told to take his rod even though he's not supposed to use it. Take it and hold it, but he's not supposed to strike the rock. And it may be that this is a test for Moses, whether he will completely obey even though he's told to take something that he is not supposed to use. And it ends up giving opportunity for him to vent in his anger, and that's a test from God. Verses 10 and 11 seem so out of character for Moses. He's a humble man, he is a patient man, and yet here he acts in a way that is not humble and not patient. Shows us that I am never far away from losing the battle with my sin nature. I must always be vigilant. No matter what my past character has shown, I am never above a failure, never above committing sin. And verse 12 becomes the pivotal verse of this passage. If we would read and skip from verse 11 to verse 13, we could read, "Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them." We could skip over verse 12, and it wouldn't affect the narrative of the account, not here. But it directly impacts the narrative as we move further on, because it does not appreciate the level of offense that Moses brought against God. In the narrative, God doesn't appear to be bothered very much as water still comes out of the rock. The people are watered, the beasts are watered, and they don't know how Moses disobeyed God. But the consequence of this, we're going to look at more in part 3. Moses' life is cut short because of this. Think about that for a minute. He dies earlier than he would have needed to because of this. Why? What's the significance here? And in part 3, we'll look at the consequence and how that affected Moses. But here, we need to look at why the consequence against Moses was so strong. And there are 3 things. Number 1, Moses disobeyed God. And God is always justified in bringing discipline and punishment, even if that be very severe in our eyes, for our sin. Sin is always serious. So he disobeys. Whatever punishment is brought down upon him is justified. Number 2, Moses took credit for a miracle that God did. And he speaks, again, it's very out of character, but he speaks words of his own volition where he says, "Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" We? What's the we? Moses isn't doing this, Aaron isn't doing this, God is doing this. And Moses takes credit for something that God does. Number 3, Moses misrepresents God. As Paul explains in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 4, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and that rock was Christ." There are some who take this literally, that there's a rock that follows them around in the desert. I don't think that needs to be. But Paul looks back on Exodus 17 and Numbers 20, and he sees a very powerful picture that Moses didn't allow to happen. In Exodus 17, we're given a picture of the rock being struck, and that is intended to symbolize Jesus being struck or killed. In Numbers 20, we're supposed to be given a picture of Moses speaking to the rock, which would show the risen Savior providing life. But instead, Moses gives a picture of the rock being struck a second time, or Jesus being killed a second time. Now, Moses may not know what he's supposed to portray. It doesn't excuse him. He disobeys. God told him what to do. Moses didn't do it. And Paul appropriates the picture in the fuller understanding of the Messiah being killed once, but only once. Jesus is not killed twice. We know that from history, but also the writer of Hebrews makes a powerful argument in chapters 9 and 10 that the new covenant is superior to the old because Jesus died once for all. He is not struck repeatedly. He is not killed repeatedly. He does not stay on the cross. He's put on the cross, but he comes down off the cross, never to go on there again. And it's interesting that as we've just come through Easter, we typically go to the New Testament as we study the Easter story and the significance of that account. But here in the Old Testament, we have a glimpse that is definitely easier for us to see looking back, as opposed to those who should have tried to see something looking ahead. But there's a picture of Jesus being struck once, but only once. And as we will make our way to the fourth part, we will see how Jesus is the living bread and he is the living water. May God encourage you and bless you as you read and study his word.